Hi folks, and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video I'm going to be building the 1/35th scale Miniart Soviet Soldiers Taking a Break. These figures are going to go alongside my recently completed Tamiya Marder 3 in a diorama. In the box alongside the figures you get some nice accessories: helmets, pouches, machine guns and various other bits and bobs. These are all moulded really nicely. The figures however are a tad soft. The faces are okay for styrene figures. The ears are a bit disappointing. The folds look really natural, but they are a little bit soft in areas. But there is one thing that is a tad annoying, and that is the mould seams are very pronounced, so I'll have to do a fair bit of cleanup. Anyway, the parts were removed from their sprues with my godhand single-edge sprue cutters. And then I got on to cleaning up some of those mould seams. The majority of these were scraped away with a Swan Morton 10A scalpel. This was scraped carefully along the seam line, removing that excess plastic. Some details were also sharpened up with the point of the blade. You are left with some rough edges, and to smooth these over I used VMS styrene cement and brushed this over the rough areas. This sort of melted the plastic down, smoothing it out nicely. This is a really handy thing to do, especially in areas that you can't reach with sandpaper. See? Nice and smooth. The parts for the figures were glued together with the same glue, so I'm using VMS fast setting styrene cement. The parts for the figures fit together surprisingly well. I was expecting a bit of a battle because of the seam lines and everything, but it seemed to be alright. One thing I did observe is that the plastic was slightly soft, so for some reason the glue took slightly longer to dry. Now that's not the end of the world, but I did accidentally pull one of these guys' legs off. Now because it would be incredibly boring if I showed you each step of every figure, I picked out a few key construction parts. The torso fit on all of the figures was a tad ambiguous, but I think I got it right. These figures looked a bit armless, so the arms were carefully glued into place. Strangely, the arms were the areas that needed the most filler, even though I tried to make sure they were seated perfectly. When it came to adding the accessories to the figures, like the ammo pouches, I needed to remove some of the styrene so they'd fit nicely. It's a tad annoying, but it makes it easier to customise your troops' loadouts. Anyway, the majority of this surgery was done with my Swan Morton 10A scalpel. The parts were dry fitted fairly regularly in this process. It's better to check and have to remove a bit more than to have to build things up with putty. And once I was happy with the fit, the parts were glued in place with my VMS cement. Seam lines on the limbs aren't too bad to deal with, but when they're on the face, it can make things a bit more challenging. Here I had to carve around the ears to remove the seam line. It was quite a challenge to work around the ear. One slip and he would have been a Soviet Vincent van Gogh. Anyway, with the rest of that excess styrene removed, the glue was painted over it again just to smooth things over. To fill the gaps on the figures, I used green stuff from Green Stuff World. This is a 2-part epoxy putty and it's fairly easy to use. This was pressed carefully into the gaps and any excess was removed and then smoothed over again with styrene cement. I never knew this worked, but I tried it and it seemed to smooth the putty out nicely. I'd rather smooth things out now than have to do some awkward sanding later on. So that's pretty much the construction. I left some of the heads off for painting to make it easier, but some were okay on the bodies. It's time to move on to the paintwork. The figures were primed with Mr. Mahogany Surfacer 1000. This was thinned with about 60% Mr. Leveling thinners and sprayed on at around 15 psi. The figures were then given a highlight layer with MRP clear dope linen, but any light colour will do. This was sprayed from above to kind of sketch out where the highlights were going to be. Initially I was going to use Russian uniform World War II for these figures, but looking at reference pictures, the uniform was actually a khaki kind of colour. So to emulate this, I mixed up Vallejo English uniform with sand yellow. This was then mixed with some VMS airbrush thinner. Because I'm a bit lazy and it's a bit more efficient, I decided to spray the base layer. I mean, why not? I've got to say though, this thinner makes model colour spray really nicely. The base coat was sprayed on in a few light layers. I didn't want to hide all of that highlighting work. This was sprayed at around 15 psi. For the flesh, I'm going to try something a bit different. Instead of diving in with a really dark shadow tone, I decided to mix up a slightly brighter one. For this I used Vallejo Cavalry Brown mixed with some medium flesh. Now it does look a bit vibrant, but as it's only a base colour it doesn't matter too much, and I wanted to try and avoid that pasty look you get when layering lots of light colours on a figure's face. When that base coat was dry, I gave the whole face a light coat of Vallejo medium flesh. The main brushes I'm using for these figures are my 0 and 2-0 Artist Opus Series S Kolinsky sables. They keep a really fine point, which is essential for figure work. For the next layer, which is the start of the highlights, I used Vallejo medium flesh mixed with a touch of basic skin tone. This was focused on any areas of the face that protrude slightly, like the nose, the forehead, the cheeks and the ears. For the next layer, I increased the amount of basic skin tone to medium flesh. With each layer, you want to lighten the colour slightly and work on a smaller area of the face to push the highlights. Also, I'm including every step on film so you can see exactly how the highlights and shadows are built up. One thing to note that I didn't do with these figures was to paint the eyes. They just weren't moulded crisply enough, and I didn't think I'd be able to do them justice. This layer is an even lightened version of medium flesh with basic skin tone. I'm adding more light as time goes on. For the next step, I reinforced some of the shadows with Vallejo Hull Red. This was highly thinned as I didn't want it to be too stark. This was painted with the tip of the brush in all the creases and shadow areas of the face. The highlights were then repainted in any areas where the Hull Red had spilled over. But this time, to warm things up, I mixed in some sunny skin tone to the basic skin tone, just for a bit of warmth. Now it's time for the final highlight layer on the face. This is about 85% basic skin tone and the rest is sunny skin tone. Now this does look quite pale and the whole face is going to need warming up again, but I'll fix that in the next step. To add more warmth, I mixed some dark vermilion with KCOLOR blender. This retards the drying time, but it also makes the colour more transparent, which is why I used it. This was highly diluted and then painted around the details of the face. And for the final stage of the face, I added a 5 o'clock shadow to some of the figures. To make this, I mixed up a touch of Prussian blue into some German camouflage black brown. This was then made more transparent with KCOLOR blender and then painted around the beard areas of the face. Whilst the glaze was still wet, I used a slightly damp brush to clean up any excess. That 5 o'clock shadow concludes the faces on this video. Now it's time to move on to the rest of the figure. The boots were painted with a mix of black and German camouflage black brown. Off camera, the boots were highlighted by adding a touch of pink to this mixture. One of the figures is either reapplying some foot wraps or applying a bandage. It's quite likely going to be foot wraps, but I decided to paint it as a bandage just to add some more interest. The base colour I used for this was Vallejo stencil. Okay, let's apply some shading to the uniforms on the figures. I started this by using English uniform with a few drops of German camouflage black brown. And luckily, I could still see the pre-shading from the airbrush showing through the base colour, so I used this as a guide as to where to put my shadows. All of the shadows were painted in this initial mix, and I darkened some of them by adding some more German camouflage black brown. The highlights were achieved by mixing English uniform with more sand yellow. And this mix was painted on the more exposed areas of the figures, like the shoulders or any rolls of fabric that might catch the light. When painting shadows and highlights on a figure, don't be afraid of pushing the contrast. Having a really high dynamic range on your figures will help them to stand out, and the details will really start to pop. Also, remember to try and use thin layers. If the paint's too thick, then it won't be as transparent, so the graduation will be really stark, and you don't want that. Next up, I'm going to reinforce some of the shadow colours. I mixed up some Vallejo dark vermilion and Prussian blue and added this to my original shadow colour. Blues and purples are often used in the art world to show shadow and distance, so that's exactly what I'm doing here. Cooler colours push things back, whilst warmer colours can bring them to the forefront. This mix was painted very sparingly in the extreme shadow areas of the figure. The epaulettes on the box art were depicted as green with red piping, so that's exactly what I did here. I used Vallejo German camo green for the body of the epaulettes and outlined them with Vallejo dark vermilion. I decided to paint the piping around the edge of the epaulettes, but what you can do is paint the red first and then block in the green afterwards. All the leather items on the model, like the ammo bags, were painted with a mix of Vallejo black and bright orange. I find Vallejo leather quite lifeless out of the bottle, and this is a great mix to emulate your own. The highlights on these items were done by adding more orange to the mix. The water bottles were painted with Russian uniform World War II. The highlights for these were achieved with a touch of sand yellow. For the shading on the water bottles, I added some German camouflage black-brown to the Russian uniform World War II. Once again, this was lightly painted on and gently blended in with a wet brush. The handle for the shovel was based in a light tan colour. I then used Abteilung 502 Sepia to make some wood grain. If you're interested in exploring wood grain in more detail, please check out my Painting Wood Grain with Oil Paint, the Ultimate Guide. The link's in the description. After the oil was applied, I removed most of it with a slightly stiff brush. This left behind the impression of wood grain. To finish up the figures, they were given a layer of VMS Matte Varnish HD. I spray this varnish straight out of the bottle at around 20 psi. It's a brilliant varnish and it leaves a dead matte, durable finish. And with this humble layer of varnish, my figures are complete. Over the last few years I haven't painted a lot of figures, and I really think to keep on top of them, you need to keep practicing those fine paintbrush skills. So while I'm happy with the end result, they look pretty good. I think if I'd kept practicing and keeping on top of those skills, they'd be a lot better. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, stick around for the diorama video, that'll be coming really soon. Also, I can't forget to thank my trusty patrons for supporting my work. You guys are awesome and I really appreciate the help that you've given the channel. There are also a few new faces which is really nice to see. If you're interested in becoming a patron, just head over to patreon.com/LPJmodels. Or if you want to support the channel without the commitment of patron, head over to buymeacoffee.com/LPJmodels. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models and I've waffled on long enough. Thanks for watching.